I didn't realize that you were part of something called the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, which is largely Maori folk or people of Maori descent. Um, I'm fascinated by that, and why is there an Indigenous Coalition for Israel in New Zealand?
Well, I established the Indigenous Coalition for Israel because I began to be concerned with the way that the narrative was being captured by the Palestinian movement, I guess you could say, giving the impression that all Indigenous people are anti-Israel, which is not true. There's quite a bedrock of support for Israel amongst Māori people, and so I felt that we needed a platform to be able to tell the other side of the story, so established the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, and at the beginning of last year, we actually established the Indigenous Embassy in Jerusalem. So really, that was the reason. It was to give platform to the other voices that tell the other side of the story.
When you use the word Indigenous, are you talking about New Zealand alone?
Well, Indigenous Coalition for Israel, our intention actually always was to build bridges with other Indigenous peoples. So the coalition, of course, we established here in New Zealand, but even from the outset, we were looking to extend our network globally. And so the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem is for all Indigenous peoples of the nations who stand in support of Israel and recognize that Jews are the Indigenous people of the land.
Okay. Your co-founder, I think, was Alfred Naro, who was a New Zealand, sorry, a National Party MP, I think for 3 terms in actual fact, from 2011 to 2020. Is he still, are you both active still currently as the co-founders and co-directors of the group?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay. So now I think he was, if I remember rightly, he was part of the Parliamentary Friends of Israel group. That I
That's
think
right.
was, is that right? Is that correct?
Yes, yes, that's correct. He re-established it when he was in Parliament.
Right. Okay. Why did I see you've done your thesis, your PhD in history from Auckland University, and your thesis, Sheree, on Zionism. Why did you choose Zionism as your thesis topic?
Well, I've been interested in Israel and the Jewish people for quite a long time now and had a lot of involvement with them. Uh, we've been involved with my husband and I with interviewing Holocaust survivors. We've interviewed over 70 Holocaust survivors. We've created exhibitions of their stories. We've traveled to Israel many times. We've hosted Israeli travelers in our homes. So we've become very involved with Israel and the Jewish community. So when I went back to university as an older student to pick up my postgraduate studies after our family had grown up and moved on, I went back to do this. And because I was quite involved with the Jewish community, I talked to some of the senior members of the community, and one of them said to me, it would be fascinating to understand why the rabbis in Auckland were so Zionistic. These were the rabbis in the period leading up to 1948. And the interesting thing is that there were only two rabbis from about 1880 to the 1970s. So two rabbis who served for 50 years first and then
Good
another
grief.
30 to 40 years, and they were
Yeah.
very Zionistic. So that was the beginning of that project to investigate why that was so.
Can you listen? It's a phrase we heard often, usually in a pejorative sense. What is Zionism? What is a Zionist?
A Zionist is, well, Zionism is the movement for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. And a Zionist is a person who recognizes or supports the establishment of a Jewish homeland, the self determination of the Jewish people. Essentially, that's what Zionism is.
So that means, so when the United Nations vote was held in what, 1946, 47, around there, establishing a Jewish homeland, Israel, the state of Israel, does that mean that New Zealand had Zionist tendencies in this country? because we supported it?
Absolutely. New Zealand had Zionist tendencies, and in fact, our government in that period was very Zionistic. Peter Fraser, William Massey stand out as government leaders who were extremely Zionistic. So certainly, New Zealand stood with the Jewish people in that period of in their desire to establish a homeland.
Yes, because we now hear, particularly from Palestinian activists, I was thinking of the John Mintos of this world, but much wider than that, certainly the young kids who are holding the Palestinian flags and going to all those protests. We now hear Zionism as a term of abuse. Does that mean that if they are, when they say anti-Zionist, they're actually anti-Israel existing at all?
Essentially, that's the logical conclusion of what they're saying, for sure. And anti-Zionism, of course, has been around for decades. You might remember in the 1970s there was a resolution that Zionism is racism, and this campaign began back then. It was a Soviet Arab campaign against Israel, and it's been a very well coordinated campaign, and we're seeing the fruit of that campaign today with this outpouring of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiment since the 7th of October. A phenomenal kind of reaction to the attack on Jewish people has been this movement against the Jewish people, but it's been a long-term concerted campaign.
Yeah, so you're right. And the United Nations General Assembly, listen, I wasn't aware of this until I did it, because frankly, New Zealand is, have always looked at the Middle East as just mad and sort of had nothing to do with it. But the United Nations General Assembly, on the 10th of November 1975, by a majority, determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Um, how does it get to be racism and racial discrimination?
Well, look, this is the way propaganda works, and we're talking about the Soviets who were masters of propaganda, is that you make a statement, and we're hearing it all the time now. We're hearing genocide, we're hearing apartheid, ethnic cleansing, these terms that are thrown out. People don't actually investigate the facts or the history or the context. The accusation is made. By the time people do the research and find out, oh, actually, that's not the case, the accusation has stuck. And so that Zionism as racism was overturned by the UN, but it was the 1990s by the time they overturned it. And, part of the issue was that Israel didn't take it seriously at the time because it was so absurd. And so when they realized that this was having a detrimental effect, then they got into process, the opposition to it. But this is the way it happens.
So the suggestion also is from people such as the academics at Massey University, Tina Blake and others, that Israel is a settler state and that the colonialism that presumably the Palestinians are experiencing is very similar to that being experienced, the after effects of anyhow, in New Zealand by Maori as well. Is that a deliberate attempt to draw a correlation, is it, between Palestinian and Maori, I guess what you could describe as uh, ill-fated experience?
Well, yes, and Israel is sort of held up by settler colonialists as the poster child of settler colonialism. But when you dig into, what are the traits of settler colonialism, and I have to say that settler colonialism itself is a political ideology. It really started to develop in the 1990s, along with a lot of other post-colonial ideologies, but it started to develop then and it's become quite pervasive since then. But when you look at the traits, so you have ideas like there's a metropole, an imperial power that sends its settlers out to a distant place and settles it, sends its people out to settle it and replicates its society in that place. And when you look at New Zealand, you can see how that has happened with Britain coming here to a distant land where they had no prior connection and setting up a British style society here. But when you look at Israel, you've got Jews who are indigenous to the land who've been there for over 3,500 years continuously, even though at times very small population, but there's always been a Jewish presence in the land, and it's there in the ground and the dirt and the stones and the bones. Jewish connection to that land is undeniable. So right there, it doesn't fit the model. But then when you think about this notion that Jews are the foreign colonizers who've come in and dispossessed the indigenous Palestinians, they didn't come in as a powerful settler group. They came in as those who had been persecuted or being persecuted in Europe, in Russia, in Eastern Europe. In the 1880s, particularly, there were pogroms that were being perpetrated on these small villages, Jewish villages, and that was the motivation for them to return to their land and enjoy and join the indigenous people who were already there, had been there the whole time. And so the model again doesn't fit of this powerful entity, this imperialist entity that goes and settles a foreign land. And so when you break down all those different traits, it really doesn't fit the model.
Why do Maori activists and Tina Blake is not the first, but I've seen, pardon me, this concept used by a number now. This doctrine of discovery that's filtering through Maori activism in this country. A suggestion that somehow it all goes back to the Pope. Why is this assumed a currency in this country?
Well, again, it has been developed within academia over quite a period of time. As the Māori movement has developed, they've drawn on the ideas of international movements, and so some of these Soviet and Arab influences have come into our thinking. So I think of, for example, Donna Awatere, when she wrote her book on Māori sovereignty, she modelled it on a Palestinian pamphlet, which painted this picture of imperialism, and she took those ideas and she applied it to New Zealand. But even before her, there are, well, around that time, actually, the 1980s, with the resurgence of language, that was a time when academics were drawing on international ideas and movements. And so we think of people like Fanon and Edward Said. Edward Said he's considered the grandfather of post-colonialism. And the interesting thing about him, if you go into the humanities, you will hear about Edward Said, who wrote Orient.